Hello everyone and welcome to a video on how to write SAQs. This is the last video of my series on how to write portions of the AP history test, and it's going to cover the short answer questions on the test. Now, what I try to go through over this video is basically what you should expect from the AP test, familiarize yourself with questions, and finally write an SAQ. Although I wouldn't be writing one in the actual video, I will be basically giving you tips and also resources on how to write this portion of the test. Additionally, at the end of the video, I'm going to be having links towards all the resources, and there are going to be timestamps throughout the video discussing each part of the SAQ that I described in the video. So, with all being said, let's get right into it. So, what is the SAQ? As I mentioned, it is the short answer question on the test. Now, there are two sections to the AP test, Section 1 and Section 2. Section 1 consists of the multiple choice and the SAQ portion. You do these two things back to back with no break. What is the SAQ portion? Well, you are basically provided four questions, okay? Four historical thinking questions, and out of those four, you are required to do three. Now, the question comes, do I get to pick whatever one I want? No. You will be given a booklet on the day of the AP test. And on that booklet, question 1 and question 2 are mandatory. Whether you like it, whether you hate it, you have to do question 1 and 2. And they just go in chronological order. You flip open the book, you see the question, it's question 1, you got to do it. Question 2, you got to do it. The time that you have leeway as a writer on the AP test is on question 3 and 4. You don't do both. Like I mentioned, you do only 3 questions. But what you do have is the option to pick between either question 3 or question 4. Okay? And you will not be writing the other essay portion or the other essay question. The short essay. My apologies, the SAQ. So you only do 3. Now, I'm going to be going through each AP history and test versions of the SAQs because they all have different historical timelines. For AP World, it is between the years 1200 and 2001 for the first two SAQs. And for the third SAQ that you pick, you either have an SAQ that comes from the year 1200 to 1750 or from 1750 to 2001. So that's kind of what you should expect. Typically, students go for the one from 1750 to 2001 because it's just history they remember better because it's later on in the year that you read about it. For A push, you go from 1754 to 1980, and that's for question 1 and question 2. And then for question 3, you have an option between 1491 and 1877 or 1865 to 2001. What that basically is saying is you either have the option of starting from Unit 1 and going all the way to Unit 5, or going from Unit 5 all the way to Unit 9. And for A push, 1754 is the start of Unit 3, and 1980 is the end of Unit 9. So it's kind of Unit 9 to Unit Unit 3 to Unit 9 for A push. For AP World, it's actually a little bit harder. You actually get content that could be from the year 1200, which is the beginning of Unit 1. Now, what are the odds they do this? Not very high. But of course, you should still be prepared for this. So if you're an AP World student, you want to be on top of your A game. A push, fortunately, you get a little bit more leeway. Unit 1 and Unit 2 are typically not prioritized that much. And lastly, if you're an AP Euro student or if you're taking the AP Euro test, you have to start from Unit 3 onwards to Unit 9 or Unit 10, however the AP test does it. And lastly, between question 3 and question 4, question 3 starts at 1648 to 1815, so Unit 3 to Unit 5. And then question 4 goes from Unit 5 all the way to Unit 9 or 10, whichever you guys have. Now, with that being said, remember that the AP test gives you 40 minutes for these SAQs. Okay, 40 minutes. To efficiently appropriate your time, I would recommend completing one SAQ within 10 minutes. That'll give you leeway to have 10 more minutes of open thinking time or open revision time. Or, let's say you do the first two SAQs in 10 minutes and you have 20 minutes for the last one, use those 20 minutes if you need those 20 minutes for whichever SAQ you believe was the hardest. Okay? So if that means, spend that last 20 minutes in the third SAQ, so be it. But I would recommend using that 10 minutes as efficiently as possible. Don't just sit there. You can always add more. But you're also kind of restricted, and that is kind of where the catch comes to this portion of the test. You were given one piece of paper for one SAQ. What does an SAQ look like? Well, it is a three-pronged question. So right here, I'll zoom in a little bit. This is only one SAQ. So the ABC only goes to question 1. and you will be given only one page to put all of A, B, and C in. So you actually have a limited amount of space. So you can't write as much as you want. This is not like the LEQ or the DBQ where you were given a bountiful amount of paper to kind of write. So if you write big, you've got to be pretty careful. Additionally, this is 20% of your grade. It is the third most weighted category on the AP test. So previously in my other videos, I said you score well in the MCQs and you score well in the DBQ, you're in range of a 4. This is where you get your 5. The LEQ is the arguably the hardest part of the test, so they kind of let you have more leeway on the DBQ, the SAQ, and the MCQ because they weight it more to kind of get and score most of your points. So if you're a student that's really on the fence of a 4 and a 5 or a 3 and a 4, this is where you lock in your score. And you lock in your score by doing damn well on this portion of the test. Okay. Now, with that being said, and with this introduction through, let us kind of go to what type of questions you're going to be seeing on this AP exam. You're going to be seeing really 4 types of questions. Question type number 1 is where they give you 2 quotes from the same historical event. In this case, this is something from A-Push and it's talking about Reconstruction. Okay? Now, what they do is they typically give you 2 opposing authors in their viewpoints. One will be pro something, one will be against it. And what the types of questions they're going to ask you is just describe a difference. All you have to do is basically just say, this guy thinks this guy thinks that. That is the extent to which you really need to go and analyze a question like that. You just kind of list it. These are the types of questions where you save a lot of your writing space. The more meatier questions comes where you have to basically explain a development that would support the author. And the best way to approach that is by looking at who the author is, looking at the time period, and saying, okay, I know this author has this political bias. That probably means that he was influenced by this historical event this way, right? Historical events influence people in different manners, right? Some people may be pro something, some people may be against something, but they may have lived through the same historical event. An example of that would be World War II. When America was about to enter World War II, there was people that were against it and people that were supporting it. So you have to understand their perspectives, and this is a question that would probably try to test you on that ability. So they would ask you like, okay, what historical event would lead to this author's difference? What historical event would maybe even lead to a similarity? Sometimes they give you, passages that the 2 authors actually agree on the same thing but bring different points. I actually had this SAQ last year, and I remember that I had to basically go backwards and think about, okay, why would this person support Reconstruction? Why would this person not support Reconstruction? And that would really just end up on, oh yeah, one guy lived in the North, one guy lived in the South probably. So that's how you kind of do it. And you would either use evidence from the documents that they talk about. You can typically get a perspective of what they're talking about within the documents or the passages that they have, or they may test you on utilizing a historical event that was not mentioned in the document to make a backup point for the differences that occurred. That's a little bit harder, but again, just kind of think about like, okay, think about the time period that this document was written in, or think about the time period this question is asking you about, and just literally kind of blurt out in your mind, okay, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, and after doing that for a few minutes, you can kind of be like, oh, boom, that's probably where they kind of differ in this perspective. So the best way to tackle these is always consider the author's bias. Where the author is from is probably going to impact that, or the social class of the author. Okay, in this case, they're historians, so it's a little bit different, but in other cases, and this is very typical and very usual on the AP test, they will give you direct passages from people living within that time period. So the best way you can establish differences is by looking at the authors, looking at where they're from, what year they wrote that thing in, who that author is. Maybe they give you like a pretty familiar guy. If they do, good for you. Use that to your advantage. Okay? You want to identify social classes. You want to identify race. You want to identify economic status. You want to identify their political stance. You want to identify where they're from, when they wrote this, why they wrote this. All these things are types of questions you have to be asking yourself on this question right here. I know it's a lot, but this is basically the hardest part of the SAQ, because after this, it actually gets markedly easier. And the reason I say that is because the SAQs will give you typically a written passage, and then the next thing they'll give you is probably a photo. That photo is typically going to be pretty easy to understand. This is like a freebie point. You kind of can self-explain a photo to yourself. Additionally, it's not maybe going to be a photo. It could be a map. It could be a chart. It could be a graph. It could be a poem. It could be art. art, photo, it's kind of the same thing. And the best way to analyze things like this is just basically say, look, you know, the author probably has an intended purpose for this. Use the same ideas of who, what, when, where, and why is this art being made or this graph being used, and just use that to basically help support your answer. For the most part, what you're going to be getting for these artists or these types of questions for art is simply, why was this artist drawing this thing? Explain the cause of this art, so all and even an effect of this art, and you can see like explain one specific event using the actual photo here. Explain one specific event that resulted from the historical situation suggested by the image, right? So the effect of this. These are cause and effect questions. So they're much more concrete. You don't have to go too in depth into it, but you still want to make sure that you kind of think about cause and effect. Okay. Now, lastly, you're going to get, and this is the only SAQ where you don't actually get a stimulus. What is a stimulus? It's basically that quote, that passage, that that photo, that graph. Those are called stimulus because they provide you kind of part of the answer if you read it. All right? This type of question is either question 3 or question 4. Okay? Now, if you go for question 4, you're probably going to be better off. But if you don't, go for question 3. Whatever you feel more comfortable with. All right? No one's judging you. But with that being said, these questions are straightforward. I mean, simply describe this. Describe this. So when they say describe, okay, you can just give a summary. Now, would I suggest always giving a summary when it says describe? No, because you don't know who your AP test grader is. But typically when they say describe, that is the easier point to get because you're just kind of giving an explanation. You're kind of just simply summarizing. Like if they ask you, describe the Black Death, you would just say, oh, it is a disease within the year 1300 that basically caused the death of many Europeans, which led to the destruction of feudalism. Kind of just do the who, what, when, where, and why, right? Try to hit the date, try to get the who it impacted, try to get the when it happened, where it happened, and why was it important. But the why and the how of the why it's important, how it happened, isn't as important for this. Definitely, you want to make sure you get the how in it. But if you don't get the why aspect, I don't think you should really fear because you should be using the why or the explanation for why things are important in the questions that ask you to explain because they want a much more thorough answer. So if you see, for example, this question, it says briefly describe one historical continuity in industrial work, briefly describe one specific historical change in industrial work. I would just basically say, oh yeah, from this period to this period, industrial work did this. In this period, industrial work stayed the same or didn't stay the same because of this, because of that. Now, when it says briefly explain one specific historical development between 1865 and 1920 that was a response to that, then I would explain why. Or I would go into further depth. I would actually do greater lengths of analysis for this. So, if I were to recommend where you should begin writing more and where you should be writing less, write less for the questions that say describe because you can somewhat summarize it. If you need to, you can write one sentence of analysis. When you say describe how that specific historical continuity happened, summary. Okay? If it says explain, you do analysis. You do a greater depth of analysis. That does not mean that you don't summarize, but the priority kind of switches. And you would want to save more space for things like where it says explain than describe. They're always going to have one describe question, as you can see. Briefly describe, using this prompt right here, briefly describe one major difference between stamps and founders' historical interpretation. That is one describe. But then it goes to explain. Again, that's the analysis. That's what they really begin to become nitpicky on. So that's where you want to prioritize most of your time. Okay? And one last thing I'd like to mention is the last question, again, does not have a stimulus. So you're kind of on your own. It's a little bit harder sometimes because that, or sometimes easier, right? Because a stimulus can be confusing or not. So consider that. Remember, first stimulus, probably a quote. They're either going to make you compare and contrast two different things, or they're simply just going to give you a quote and ask you to describe the point of view of some author, which you can see in this SAQ right here. Then they're going to give you a photo, text, some type of text that is very short, probably with the photo, a graph, a chart, so on and so forth, a map, and explain the cause and effect for that type of thing. And then lastly, you're going to have the no stimulus questions, which are the ones that you get to choose from, 3 or 4. You get to only do one, remember. And when you do that one, they're probably going to be only asking for 2 describes and 1 explain. And remember that you always want to go further in depth for the explain ones. Now that you're familiar with this type of stuff, how should you write it? This is kind of the crux of it. This is what you've probably been waiting for. So I would first, for those people that really want to know, like, what is the sentence length? These are short answer questions. You get limited space. 3 sentences, bare minimum. Bare minimum. I can't spell sentences for my life. 3 sentences, bare minimum. Okay? I would suggest 4 to 5, or 4 to 5 sentence, or recommended 4 to 5 sentences, um, with a greater priority on analysis. Why do I always care about analysis, or why do I always keep on mentioning analysis? Because this actually shows that you can comprehend and understand the topic material that is being taught. Okay, with that being said, how do I write it? I'm going to be very generic, but if you want to write a thesis, just respond to the prompt. Maybe even restate it. These are not LEQ or DBQ theses. They're not complex. Restate the prompt with a defensible argument. That's really it. With a defensible argument. So, or we'll basically respond to it. And I'm going to give you an example. Briefly describe one specific historical continuity in industrial work in the period from 1865 to 1898. I would say one historical continuity between the period of 1865 to 1898. As you can see, I directly restated the prompt was that factory work continued to be a grueling task. And then I would give an example of it. Many workers would work in poor conditions, and I would explain what a poor condition is, like cramped areas with tons of and by the way, like, the grammar doesn't matter for this stuff, so I know I sound like a kindergartner writing this, but it's just kind of to get the point away. Like cramped areas with tons of unsanitary um, tons of unsanitary areas where mice could roam around, and I don't know, heating, right? No heating, so everyone was sweaty. And then my analysis would be the reason that the 2 periods of time are similar, work in poor conditions in both time periods. The reason that the 2 are therefore similar is that they faced, or is that their work conditions would prompt them to have a poor quality of life, since they could frequently get sick, preventing them from making a living and supporting their families, which would in turn increase crime rates in urban areas. That's analysis, right? So I basically responded to the thesis. Now, after I've written it, and by the way, this is not a perfect example, but it's something that I can, write within 2 minutes. That I'd say gives me a pretty decent chance of getting the point. And even then, look, this was a describe question, a briefly describe question. So I actually did extra analysis, right? But my thesis was literally a direct restatement. Super easy. Evidence, I brought literal facts to the table, and then I explained why those facts would contribute to that. Basically, I just said in this case, both conditions had really poor, working environments. And as a result of these working environments, the 2 periods of time are similar in the sense that they led to poor quality of life for their workers, because the workers would then work in cramped areas where they'd get sick, they couldn't support their families, then their families would, lead to a life, well, not their family, but they would have to go to a life of crime because they couldn't get a job, so they'd have to go steal, so on and so forth. That leads to domestic instability. Domestic instability leads to the country or the state, typically, if it's a push, state having to interfere, which prevents them from prioritizing their needs. You see how I'm going further and further with this analysis? You could do that. You could do that, right? And you could kind of connect it to both periods of time, but you don't really have to. You could kind of stop where I just stopped. So I hope that makes sense. I would recommend the style of analysis you do is really just cause and effect. Make your evidence the causes, all right? List them as the causes. Like I basically said here, poor working conditions. Maybe I could have gotten even in more depth, right? Explain where those poor working conditions originate from, right? The capitalists at the time really didn't care about people's, living. They just wanted to make profit, so they wouldn't pay money for sanitary checks, right? They make more money because they can centralize that profit if they save from not spending. So then I could say that led to poor conditions, and that's really just a cause. That's that. And by the way, the AP graders love this. And then at the end of my analysis, I basically just say, okay, from this cause, all these effects happen. From the poor working conditions, were the poor working conditions created a poor quality of life at home, right? Because A, you don't even have a job, so you may not be able to afford um, your needs. B, you get sick, right? C, you may not get a job anymore. So you see how like I'm attacking a lot of points of analysis here. Of course, like I didn't even explain that there. Like I just said they could get frequently sick, but I would probably preventing them from making a living and supporting their families since they wouldn't have a job. Um, See, that's one analysis right here, right? But then which in turn would increase crime rates in urban areas as people tried to find alternative measures to make ends meet, right? That is another type of analysis. Well, that is another additional supporting type of analysis right there. Because they say, hey, look, this is effect 1 here, and this is effect 2 here. I'm 100% certain the AP graders are going to go crazy over something like this, okay? So if you can pack more analysis into what you got, do it. And remember, the analysis is the effects of everything. So, as a recap, because this is the last part of the video, all you got to do to write an SAQ is restate the thesis, make sure you get the who, what, when, where, and why, go to your evidence, and then go to your analysis. Your evidence and your analysis should be cause, effect. Cause, effect. Put more analysis into areas where they ask you to explain. This should be around 3 to 5 sentences per, but I would suggest you prioritizing the questions where they ask you to explain instead of describe, because if you want to describe, you really kind of just can stop at the evidence part, because they're just looking for more of a summary. Kind of like, did you just do the reading on a shallow level versus did you really understand the reading on an in-depth level from what you read in history? That's really it to an SAQ. It's a very easy section to get. So remember, if you are between that border of a 3 to 4, 4 to 5, 2 to 3, this is going to save your grade, so you want to make sure you do damn good on it. For practice, I would suggest trying to fit every SAQ that you write within a 10-minute writing period, and then spend that last 10 minutes you get on the SAQ portion to really fine-tune what you have written. Okay? That is all for this video. Good luck on your SAQs. Thank you for watching.